Water. That was the first sensation she felt as her mind slowly came back to her. It was cold and refreshing. She could tell her body was craving it, wanting more as it gently poured into its mouth. It flowed quickly down her throat, and just as she wanted more, it stopped. It felt as though she was being teased out of getting something she needed. She tried to move her body, but she didn't feel anything move. It was as if it was surrounded by a dark abyss in her own mind, in which she couldn't even contact her own body. She wanted to raise a leg, open her eyes, listen to the world around her, ask for more water, but nothing came of it. However, she was finally able to pick up a faint sound. It was a dull beating from inside her head. Was it inside of her head? Whatever it was coming from a slow, rhythmic beating. It took her a few moments to realize what the beating was. It was her heart. If she could hear her heart, she knew she was still alive. When she realized she was alive, the last moments before she found herself in this abyss came back to her mind. A white blaze of rage, that broken alicorn-like creature, Rarity being put in danger, that strange world she had found herself trapped in. It all came back like a torrential flood, overwhelming her with the memories. She didn't know where she was anymore, or how long she had been knocked out. She needed to wake up. She needed to make sure that Rarity was okay. Twilight had seen the sword going through her body, but she didn't know how serious the damage was. It had to have been serious. A wound like that could very easily take a pony's life. Her body was coming back to her. She could feel the dull senses returning to the tips of her nerves. She opened her mouth and, conscienceless, took in a breath of air, feeling the excessive air fill her lungs. She tried to open her eyes, but closed them as soon as the piercing light attacked her, burning her vision. Her ears turned back on next, first hearing a dull buzz that might have been passing for a noise that was sounding like something moving around. She tried to concentrate harder, making out that it was a shifting thing around the world. She tried to open her eyes again. The searing light returned, forcing her to close them once more. This time she forced herself to keep her eyes open to adjust to the light, though squinted her eyes as the burning pain of the light slowly began to fade away, her eyes still sensitive to the sensation of being in a bright room. As her blindness faded, she could slowly make out a ceiling, a brownish-gray ceiling, looking as if it belonged in an old building long since abandoned. Imagery she long since began to expect of this world. She gently turned her head to where she could hear the sounds of things being shifted. She could see the backside of a pony, particularly the striking dark red hair of its tail and what seemed to be an amber coat. Her eyes were still adjusting to seeing once more, unaware of just how long she'd had them closed. With a pained breath, she finally managed to get words to escape her throat. "Hello?" It was barely anything but a raspy whisper, but it seemed to have caught the pony's attention. The pony turned around, so his face was within her view. She tried to discern if she knew the pony as it walked closer, giving her a better view. As the pony grew closer, she was able to discern its identity. "Lance? You're awake." Lance's voice was deadpan, though it had a hint of snarky surprise in his voice that it always seemed to carry. "I guess I shouldn't be surprised. This world has that effect on ponies." "Lance." The lavender unicorn groaned, trying to move, only to have her efforts stopped by pain shooting through her shoulder. She was bedbound for the moment. But, more importantly, she just wanted answers. With her whispered, raspy voice, she tried to talk. What happened? Her voice cut out as she tried to speak. Her mouth and throat were dry. She felt so dehydrated. "Water," she managed to gasp. Of course. The Amber Pegasus nodded his head, knowing exactly what the unicorn wanted. He quickly walked over to a bucket near the ground and picked it up, carrying it into her line of sight. She wasn't sure where she was, but with him leaving her vision, it gave her a chance to look around. Her vision was finally coming back to her, and she could see that she was in what looked like a hotel of some kind. She was on the bed, and she could see a spot on a bedside table with a lamp on it, a dresser for keeping clothes or items. There must have been a bathroom within the room, typical of a hotel, as she heard a tap turn on, Lance filling his bucket with water. It wasn't long before Lance returned and placed the bucket down next to the bed. He then took a smaller bowl and scooped up water from it, before pressing it gently against the unicorn's lips. "I need you to drink slowly. I know you're thirsty, but just take it a little at a time." He tipped the bowl as the unicorn understood. She opened her mouth and felt the cold water flow down her mouth. She slowly gulped, feeling the refreshing water coat her throat once again. Lance must have given her water to drink while she was asleep, likely to try and keep her hydrated. The two of them stayed quiet for a while, Lance dipping the bowl into the bucket several times and returning it to her lips so that she could gulp the water down. She wished she could just take the whole bucket and pour it into her stomach, but she could already tell the water she was drinking was churning in her stomach. If she drank too much, she'd be sick. Lance placed the bowl against her lips once more, though this time the unicorn tilted her head away a little, signaling she'd had enough. Lance understood and moved the bowl away, placing it on the nightstand. "Think you can talk now?" he asked curiously, examining her face for a reaction. "I think so." The unicorn wheezed lightly, finally feeling moisture returning to her mouth and throat, even if it was temporary. "What happened, Lance?" was the first question that sprung to her mind. "I was hoping you could tell me." Lance furrowed his brow in slight frustration. "I found you in the hotel lobby, face down and bleeding to your death. You'd already lost a huge amount of blood by the time I found you. I honestly figured you were dead from how much I saw. But a quick check saw that you still had a heartbeat, so I patched you up and brought you here." He looked down at her body. "It has to be this place. Your wounds weren't mortal, but your blood loss was. It's likely you'll never have use of your right foreleg again." The lavender unicorn's eyes widened as she tried to lift herself up, feeling a backlash of pain strike her body. She gritted her teeth through the pain and tried to sit up. Lance saw what she was trying to do and raised his own hooves to help her. He carefully got her into a sitting position, and she finally took a look at her body. Around her shoulder and down, most of her right foreleg was covered in bloodied bandages. The sight made her queasy, thinking that this had actually happened to her body. She tried to move the leg and felt nothing but searing pain assault her body. She whimpered and grimaced from the pain, tears forming at the edges of her eyes. She never thought something like this would ever happen to her. She tried to take her attention away from her leg, to survey the rest of her. She had other bandages wrapped around her legs and flank, but those cuts were shallow. They'd heal. Her leg might never. I see." Twilight managed to choke out, her words catching on a lump in her throat. The tears beginning to spill from the edges of her eyes, a mixture of pain and sorrow overwhelming her. How's Rarity?" She had to ask. She had to know how her friend was doing. "Rarity?" Lance asked with a strange tone in his voice. "What do you mean?" "Rarity!" The unicorn shook her head, looking at him with a glare. "She was right there with me. In fact, she was likely hurt worse than me. You should have helped her first before helping me." She was ready to bite his head off for not being direct with her, for not having helped one of her friends in their time of need. Lance just sat there quietly, looking at the fuming mare before him with a look of mixed confusion and understanding. His voice slowly shifted into a firm yet harsh look. His mind had been listening to every word and had already come to a realization that the unicorn before him was desperately trying to avoid. She didn't want to hear the truth, but the words escaped Lance's mouth before she could stop him. "Twilight, you were the only one I found. If your friend was actually as injured as you claim, I would have found a second bloodstain if she had wandered off or been dragged away." Lance shook his head. "I found you, and you alone. with only enough blood to have come from you. He looked into the mare's face as it fell, knowing the weight of the words he just told her. I'm sorry, but your friend's fate is now in the grip of this world. No. Twilight felt herself losing strength in her body. Her body slid down into a lying position as she stared at nothing. Her mind didn't want the reality to be true. If only one of them was saved, why did it have to be her? Why couldn't Rarity have been the one to be saved instead? Was this some kind of cruel joke being played on her? She buried her face in her pillow, and with her good leg held it to her face. She just let out as much as she could into the pillow. The stress of the world being found in her. The disbelief that she couldn't save one of her dearest friends. The fact that she may never be able to walk the same again. She let it all out into the pillow. She didn't know how long she did it for. Time seemed frozen to her at that instant. She'd killed living creatures that day. Things she had called monsters that had wanted to hurt her, but they were still alive. She'd left Spike in the hands of a pony she barely knew, who now seemed to have a connection to this world, even if it was a jump to conclusion. She'd lost her leg, and she'd lost one of her dearest friends. All for what? What had we gained from all this? Who benefited from this horror story that had made itself real? She let it all out until there seemed to be nothing left to let out. Her throat was dry again, and she seemed to be out of tears. Her pillow wasn't all that wet. She couldn't be surprised, though. She was dehydrated. She raised her head and rubbed her face, trying to dry it of the tears. She looked at Lance, who was holding out another bowl of water for her. She bowed her head softly in thanks, accepting the water. With another bowl down, she took a deep breath, trying to calm her nerves. She didn't want to be the one to start the conversation back up. She didn't know where to take it. Reality was stingingly deep right now, and she wanted some shred of comfort, some reason to give her hope for the situation. It's possible she's alive, you know. Lance broke the ice first. Twilight looked up at him in shock. After all, I found you. I'm not sure how you got separated from her, but it's possible she was found by some pony, and was patched up as well. But you said... Twilight sniffed, rubbing her face once more. I know what I said. Lance almost barked, his abrasive nature still showing through his bedside manners. But your friend is only dead if you let that be the inevitability. There's always a chance that she could still be alive, and if she is, then you need to believe in her, and find her. Lance closed his eyes. Once you've given up on some pony, then there's no chance of saving them. The mare was stunned into silence for a moment. She couldn't help but think his words over as she lay there, injured beyond what she had ever thought she would be. But he did speak the truth. If she gave up on Rarity, then there would be no chance that she would be alive somewhere. She had to have faith that her friend was still alive. It was the only thing she could rely on in this cruel world. Thanks, Lance. Twilight smiled, trying once more to sit up, only to be rocked with the pain of her shoulder wound. Lance reached out and helped her to sit up once more. I have to go look for her, but I don't know how I'll be able to do anything with my leg like this. She bit the bottom of her lip, looking down at her arm. Somehow she expected it to be in constant pain, but it appeared to only hurt when she tried to move it. Otherwise, she could just feel a dull throb coming from it. Lance thought about that for a moment, before walking towards the drawers in the room. Twilight watched him curiously, not quite sure what he was doing. He opened the drawer and rummaged through it for a moment before pulling out a brown bottle that Twilight recognized. He carefully brought it over to the bed. Now, I normally would never offer this stuff as a type of medicine. Lance grunted, as though the very idea of what he was about to offer offended him. As far as I know, there's no medical backing to this stuff. It might as well be snake oil somebody slapped a label on and managed to call it a miracle drug. I'm convinced that in the normal world all this does is give patients false hope. However, Lance glanced around the room wearily. In this world, it actually seems to be a medical boon. I found it near your body, so I think you should drink it. Lance gripped the bottle with his hooves and brought his mouth down to the cap. With a quick twist of the bottle, he opened it and held it up to her lips. Twilight was hesitant to drink the strange medicine, but Lance was a doctor and Fluttershy's dad. He wouldn't do anything to purposefully hurt her. Even if he came off a little harsh, she knew he was a good stallion. She opened her mouth and let the strange liquid enter her mouth. It was certainly bitter, as she expected medicine to be. It tried to mask the flavor behind some artificial strawberry flavoring, though it didn't seem to help the bitter mess sliding down her throat. She didn't think she'd be able to stomach the whole bottle, but before she knew it, she had swallowed every last drop. She wasn't quite sure what was supposed to be feeling after drinking it, though. Then it hit her. It felt as though her energy had returned to her. The pain in her shoulder began to numb, and she was suddenly alert. She could feel her magic reservoir getting a kick into high gear. She suddenly got the feeling as though Lance had just drugged her. "It's weird, I know," Lance said, placing the empty bottle on the nightstand. "As I said, I'm certain this is nothing more than snake oil with a fancy label. But for some reason, in this world it's more than that." He looked her over, noticing Twilight lift herself up a little more, with her renewed energy. "Your wound is still severe. It might open if you strain it, but I think you should try standing." Twilight gave him a look of utter shock. "I know. I'm right here if anything happens. I'll take care of you right away. Just please, try this for me," he asked as best he could, though his gruff voice made it seem like a demand. Twilight hesitated for a moment, but Lance held out his hoofs to help. With her good hoof, she took his and scooted towards the edge of the bed, with very slow, careful movements. Her back hooves touched the floor first, before Lance helped hoist her up, getting her to stand on her 3 good legs, the bandaged hoof hanging loosely in the air. The unicorn expected to have no energy, to fall over and find herself in pain, unable to escape the floor's grip until Lance put her back on the bed. Yet there she was, standing on her 3 good legs. Even her bad leg, that was beyond repair as it should be, was only giving her a dull ache. It just refused to move when she gave it orders, but she could walk again. "It's just as I thought." Lance grunted with a strange mixture of annoyance and relief. "Years of medical knowledge flushed down the drain by some world that thinks it can make up the rules as it goes." Lance placed a hoof against the injured mare's good shoulder, testing her reaction to the touch. "How do you feel? The pain should be debilitating, but I suspect it's not." Yeah, Twilight muttered. His hoof on her shoulder felt just like any other time a pony had touched her. "It's a dull throb at best." She tried to move the arm and winced, pain rocketing through her shoulder. "It only really hurts when I try to move it." "Makes sense." Lance put his hoof back to the floor. "There's not much I can do to help that, as we are. Just don't move it much." He nodded his head before turning to his bag, organizing the things in it once more. Twilight noticed it was the same purple bag with strange stitching that he had brought to the wedding. He then pulled out a long cloth with a large pad attached to it. He brought it over to her body, and before she could protest, he was already slinging it around her neck. "I'm going to put your leg into a sling, which means I need to move your bad leg for a moment." Lance grunted, knowing that he was about to hurt her. "So, try and deal with the pain for now, all right?" The unicorn gulped, realizing his words before nodding. Lance then took a deep breath and gently grabbed hold of her bad leg and began to position it in the sling. Pain soared through Twilight's mind as the torn nerves in her shoulder refused the idea of moving. She grit her teeth and clenched her eyes, just trying to push her way through the pain. Then as soon as it began, it was over. Twilight let out a breath as she had been holding in as her shoulder shot several throbs of pain into her mind, before slowly fading back into a dull throb. It had been an agonizing procedure, but she could now feel her leg resting comfortably against her body. She'd be able to walk more comfortably now, though maneuvering on 3 legs would still be difficult. Once he'd finished with the sling and made sure it was comfortable on her body, He turned back to his bag to make everything was inside of it and organized. Twilight watched him quietly before he could close the bag and placed it on his back. "All right. When I found you, I had also found a few things laying around your body. I left them in that drawer," he said, pointing to where he had pulled the health drink from. The unicorn looked to where Lance was pointing, slowly making her way over to it. She lit the drawer with her magic, pulled it open, and scanned the contents inside. The first thing her eyes fell upon was the handle of the broken, rusty sword. She levitated it up, looking at it. Much of the sharpened, pointed end had been broken off. Not surprising, considering the battle it had just survived. The edges were as dull as ever. The weapon was slowly becoming more and more of an edged, bludgeoning device rather than a sword, or even a dagger. The steel was stained with dried blood, no doubt a result of the battle as well. She let out a soft sigh and closed her eyes, feeling around in her magic reservoir and opening up a space within it. The sword disappeared into the hole, holding on to it for her until she needed it again. The next thing she noticed were the several notes and papers she had gathered when she left the library. She levitated each of them up and inspected them, seeing if anything had changed. Many were now smeared with blood marks, a clear indication they landed on the ground after she'd passed out. She was still able to read the text on most of them, and even found the note that had the distorted scribbles on it, the one she'd wiped the blood off with her face from. Only one note stood out from them, the one that Spike had found within the library. She read the words to herself again, a chill running down her spine. "When all is lost, when the darkness is at its strongest, when all is cold and bleak, you'll find the light." The note unsettled her. She'd already seen the darkness, seen things that seemed cold and bleak. Could they really get worse than this? She'd lost her friends, her mentor, Rarity was severely injured somewhere, and she'd almost completely lost her leg. How could she find the light in a world like this? She shook her head, trying to get the negative thoughts out of her mind. She had to stay focused. If things were going to get worse, she just had to remain strong. Look out for herself, and keep her head held high. She placed these within her reservoir as well, compelled to hold on to them. They didn't take up as much space as most of the other items that she had did, so she could comfortably hold on to them for the time being, though she was going to be more careful about how much magic she expelled from now on. Next she saw the Canterlot Archives pendant, the rune she had found still clipped from the string. The purple aura surrounded the pendant, and she checked the crystal at the end of it, the light turning on in the drawer. She still had a way to illuminate dark areas without having to cast her light spell. She silently thanked Celestia she still had it, before placing it around her neck. The last thing at the bottom of the drawer was the last thing she expected to see. There were 3 books, 2 with covers that she recognized, and one that was now blank. She levitated the 3 books up, reading the covers of the 2 she recognized. The Old Widow, the Heaven's Food. That meant the blank book had to be The Cat Who Married a Mouse. How did these get here? The unicorn mumbled to herself, examining the tomes. I left these behind. She opened the blank book, flipping through several pages. It was now completely empty, not even a trace that it had once contained text. She closed the book and just stared at it. She knew it had text originally. She still remembered the basis of the story. She placed the empty book back down in the drawer. If it was empty, she didn't need to bring it with her. However, she made a hole in her magic for the other 2 books, and soon they found themselves in a reservoir as well. "Are you ready?" Lance asked in that usual gruff manner. Twilight wasn't sure what to make of it, but for the time just shrugged it off. "Yeah," she answered quickly, turning around to face the stallion. "Do we know where we're going, though? I mean, I'd like to go back to where you found me, see if we can find any trace of Rarity." "Well, I found you in the library, and we'll pass through there on our way out," Lance explained quickly. "As for where, I'm not sure. As far as I can tell, wandering around leads to answers, and staying in one place too long is a bad idea." Another wave of various emotions seemed to run across Lance's face, as though he was considering something very serious. Twilight blinked in confusion, before a look of determination hit Lance, and he stepped close to her. "Twilight, I need you to understand something." What is it?" she asked hesitantly. There was something about the edge of his voice that was unsettling her. "Before we head out, I need you to be absolutely sure. If I wasn't here, could you continue on by yourself?" He seemed to glare, though the glare seemed unnecessary for the context of his words. I'd have no choice, right?" Twilight hesitated for a moment with her answer. "I can walk just fine. I admit it's a little awkward on 3 hooves, but you've helped me a lot." "Good." He closed his eyes with a grunt. "Because it's more than likely we're going to be separated. I'm not going to be able to take care of you where we are, and I need to know that you can take care of yourself." "Huh? Why would we be separated?" Twilight's ears flattened at his words. "We found each other. Let's stick together. We'll be able to survive better." "It's not that simple," Lance barked, glaring at Twilight, causing her to nearly jump out of her skin. "This world around us, this place that isn't Ponyville, or even Equestria, this world that is its own being, it has a mind of its own. And it doesn't like ponies being together." He drew in closer to Twilight, the unicorn finding herself backing up to the drawers. "It separates us, divides us, and makes us fools for its own amusement. You can't trust anyone here, Twilight. I brought you here from the lobby, healed your wounds, and waited for you to recover. But it's very possible you're not really Twilight, but rather this world's sick imagining of her." Twilight was afraid. She fell to her haunches, just staring at the Pegasus before her, who was bearing down on her, unable to move or disobey him. "The same goes for you. You can't believe I'm Lance, or that I helped you with good intentions. This world is cutthroat, and won't hesitate to mess with your heart and spit in your face. Just when you think you figured it out, it'll smack you and make you start all over again. Do you understand? That is the kind of world we've found ourselves in. And does it have any right to be messing with our heads?" Lance growled and grit his teeth, his nose pressing against Twilight's as his eyes bore into her. "What right does this world have to do that to ponies? Who thinks they can mess with the dead and make mockeries of them? Who thinks they can disrespect my posy?" he yelled, finally closing his eyes as he grit his teeth. The spell Twilight had been under broke at that moment, and she could finally breathe, perspiration rolling down her neck as she gulped down a lump that had formed in her throat. "Lance," Twilight tried to speak, to get the stallion to stop yelling at her for things she couldn't control. Lance's eyes shot open in sudden realization of what he'd just done. He took a few steps away from Twilight, cursing himself under his breath several times. Twilight put her good hoof to her chest, trying to calm her racing heart. She couldn't explain what just happened to her. Lance had simply looked her in the eye, and suddenly she found herself deadlocked in fear, unable to do anything. "Forgive me, Twilight." Lance continued to curse himself. "This world is playing with my mind." He cut himself off, as if refusing to say any more. He took a deep breath and turned to face her, his eyes much calmer now, his face still rough around the edges, but providing a calming look. "I'll stay with you for as long as I can, as long as this world permits me. My words still hold true, though. You can't trust me, and I can't trust you." He let out a long sigh as he closed his eyes. "But I can't just leave my patient once I've treated them." It took several more seconds for Twilight to try to stand. She mentally willed her legs to stop shaking, and once they did, she was able to stand properly again. She swallowed once more, trying to calm herself. It wasn't that Lance was mad at her. She understood that. She could see past his anger. It wasn't directed at her, but at the world. She'd just been unfortunate to be in the way when it had come to head. It's okay, Lance." She spoke more, trying to convince herself than the stallion before her. "You're mad at the world, not me. We need to look out for each other, even if what you say is true." The unicorn gulped, really hoping it wasn't true. Lance simply nodded, not wanting to risk opening another can of worms on the unicorn. He simply walked over to the door and placed his hoof on it to open, before stopping a moment. He turned to look at the injured mare. "You ready?" He had to make sure before opening the door. Yeah, I'm ready." Twilight nodded her head slowly, following the line behind the stallion. Lance nodded his head in confirmation and swung the door open. He stepped into the hallway beyond the room, and the unicorn followed carefully behind him. Stale air hit her nose, first, just as she began to examine the hallway. The hallway was decaying, just as Twilight figured it would be. The walls were stained with what appeared to be water and mold. Most of the ceiling was hanging loose, as if torn apart by something, and the carpet beneath her hooves was dry, hardened to almost a bristling state. Each step set out a loud crunch on the ruined carpet. This isn't where the room was before. Lance glared at the hallway. "I brought you into a room near the lobby. This is a new hallway." "It's playing tricks on our minds?" Twilight gulped down her words. "I'm certain of it. Let's try and find out a way back to the lobby. Stay close to me," Lance said, looking around before heading down the hallway in a direction that looked like it might lead somewhere. Twilight followed after him, taking a look at the doors that lined the hallway. Most were either boarded up with wood, broken, or paved over with cement. Twilight couldn't understand what the meaning behind it was. What purpose did boarding up the doors serve? There was silence between them as they walked. A silent understanding between them that they needed to keep their wits about them. The world wasn't going to spare them any mercy, something they both seemed to have learned from experience. They just listened to the crunching of the carpet under their hooves. As they were getting closer to the bend in the hallway, a noise began to play that caught both their ears. Twilight looked down at her rune, hearing the familiar buzzing emanating from the device. Then a loud thud could be heard, which caught their attention. "Get back!" Lance shouted, turning around as fast as his body could manage. A loud crash echoed throughout the hallway as the ceiling in front of them caved in. Dust and debris flew around them as the wind rushed and pushed them both down the hall. The two ponies found themselves pushed back, coughing as the dust attacked their mouths. The both of them looked in the direction of the fallen ceiling, seeing what had caused the collapse. There was an orb, as though it was made of shadows, pulsating in the middle of the debris. The air around it was distorted, warping the very world around it. From the middle, a head began to form, pulling away from the shadows. A black-skinned pony head with a long snout. It opened its eyes, containing nothing but the whites of its eyes. It tried to open its mouth, but the lips were sewn shut, just letting out a guttural growl of pain and anger. Two hooves appeared from the oozing darkness, shackled by chains to the darkness itself. The creature let out a growl that echoed through the hallway, almost as if it was shifting the air with its voice alone. Lance was instantly on his heels, pushing Twilight, who had fallen into a stunned daze, staring at the creature. "Move!" he yelled, snapping her back to her senses. She turned on her hooves and began to run, tripping at her awkward coordination and finding herself planted against the ground. The creature let out a wail once more, Lance putting his hooves on Twilight to try and get her back to her legs. Wood loudly creaked and began to splinter, and the ponies looked back at the creature as the large black ribbon suddenly appeared from the center of the mass, breaking straight through the walls of the hallway. Twilight scrambled to her hooves, Lance pushing against her as they moved. Lance cried out in sharp pain, slamming to the ground as the ribbon came crashing down onto his back. Twilight gasped in shock, her brain trying to process everything that had been thrown at her. The black ribbon quickly began to wrap around him, his eyes widening as he realized what was happening. "Lance!" Twilight cried out, grabbing hold of his hooves as the ribbon suddenly became taut, pulling straight back towards the creature. Lance let out a horrified cry of pain, coughing as he felt his body being yanked in two directions. Twilight's hooves scraped across the floor as she tugged, trying to free the Pegasus from the monster's grip. Its cry echoed through the hallway once more, overbearing the buzzing of her medallion. The unicorn was being dragged, the carpet not giving her much room for grip. With only one hoof grabbing Lance, she didn't have much strength to bear. She had to go with what she had. Her horn lit up, the purple aura now surrounding Lance. She pulled with everything she could muster, both physically and magically, trying to free Lance from the grip. A loud growl came from the monster, unhappy with his development. As the darkness that made up its body, a second ribbon burst out, racing across the hallway. Twilight's eyes opened in horror as she saw it coming, trying to move out of its way in time. The ribbon crashed into her body, a hoof letting go of Lance. Her whole body was carried, sailing through the air. The ribbon pressed down on her, sending her hurtling straight for the side of the hallway. Another loud crack issued through the hall as she was slammed straight into a door. Twilight struck the room's floor and tumbled, coughing loudly as her body screamed in pain. She grimaced, opening her eyes to look at the door she'd been thrown against. "Twilight!" The horrified yell of the Pegasus came again. She tried to get to her hooves, only to have the black ribbon entering the room coming for her. She gritted her teeth quickly, summoning the blunt dagger from her reservoir. She didn't have any time for aim. She just sent the dagger sailing through the air as hard as she could throw it. The metal stuck the ribbon, piercing straight through it and lodging itself in the ribbon. Blood splattered against the wall from where the dagger had impaled the cloth. The ribbon seemed to shriek, as if pain at the intrusion of the metal into it. It flailed across the room in rapid movements, as if no longer sure of what it should do. It came rushing back, slamming against the door as it slammed Twilight into. It gripped against the edges of the wooden door before pulling it back into the hallway, slamming the door shut with it. Her medallion instantly grew quiet, and the world was silent. Twilight was breathing heavily, staring at the door, unable to believe what had just happened. She struggled to stand, her shoulders crying out in agony at the abuse she was sustaining, but she forced herself to push it aside. She managed to stand, her legs shaking underneath her body. She lit her horn with magic, and grabbed the handle of the door, trying to force it open. She had to go back out and help Lance. The door didn't budge, refusing to open as though it were jammed. Twilight grunted in displeasure, hopping over to the door and pressing her hoof against the handle. She tried to force the door open, but the only thing she got off of her efforts were the incessant clicking noises telling her it was jammed. "Lance!" Twilight yelled as loudly as she could, resting her chest against the door before banging loudly against it with her good hoof. Silence only returned her knocks. She couldn't hear anything out there anymore. No breaking of wood, no stallion screaming in pain, not even the echoing growl of the creature. She smashed her head against the door, letting out a pained cry. She was just with Lance. She could have done more to save him, but the moment the creature showed up, she had frozen in place. She couldn't believe she'd done that. Lance didn't stand a chance against that monster on his own, and it was her fault for having frozen up. Was it because she was injured? Was she scared that she wasn't going to be able to protect herself? Not that she could anymore. She'd just lost her weapon. Again. "I'm sorry, Lance," the mare muttered under her breath, hoping that the stallion would be all right. She had no way of guaranteeing his well-being, but it was just as he had told her. If she assumed he was dead, then there'd be no way she could help him at all. Though she was kicking herself, she just had to figure out what to do next. She had to keep her mind calm and realize that if she had done nothing but panic, she'd get nowhere, and fast. Twilight took several deep breaths from her forehead, pressing against the door, trying to calm her racing heart. Once she felt significantly calmed, she stood on 3 hooves and looked around the room to examine it, as she found herself to be locked in. The mare gasped, clasping her good hoof over her mouth, as her eyes fell upon the body of a white unicorn with a fiery red hair that had been nailed to the wall, its forelegs spread wide, its back legs pinned below her. It was in the same pose as Winter had been, her blood now seeping down the wall and onto a desk right below the body that had a picture frame sitting on top of it. Moondancer! Twilight cried in shock. She sprung to her hooves and ran to the body of her old friend, staring in horror at the wounds all over her body. She was covered in lacerations, just as Winter had been. Her blood was still fresh and wet, dripping down the wall. Moondancer, please! Tell me you're okay! Twilight cried out. Her magic lit up and tried to grab the nails that were embedded into Moondancer's leg. The magic refused to catch under the nails, as if something was repelling the magic. Twilight. The lavender unicorn froze as she heard the voice, snapping her head straight to Moondancer's face. The white unicorn was looking back down at her, the fire-red hair covering one of her eyes, the other staring soullessly back at the mirror before her. The picture. Moondancer spoke in a quiet, hushed voice that Twilight could only barely catch. The picture? Twilight looked down at the desk Moondancer was hung above. Just on the edge of the desk, about to touch the blood, the small square pictures frame stood there, showing a half-burnt picture of Twilight as a filly. Twilight blinked in confusion, raising her hoof to touch the strange picture. Suddenly, light burst forth from the picture, causing the lavender unicorn to yelp and cover her eyes with her hoof. The sound of reels rolling hit her eyes, and she could suddenly hear the shuffling of hooves. She moved her hoof away from her eyes to see that the picture was now projecting light, a film that was being played on the wall opposite of Moondancer. The rest of the room had grown dark, only illuminating by the light of the projector. The unicorn stared in disbelief as the gray and torn static images rolled across the screen. Displayed inside the image was a younger Twilight, staring out a large window in Canterlot, the hoofsteps of her mentor approaching from behind. "What's the matter, Twilight?" The white alicorn asked, stepping up to the filly, her voice coming out at a distorted part of the movie. "Oh, it's nothing, Prince. I'm sorry I troubled you," filly Twilight said, her voice cutting in and out as she tried to return to her work. "Are you sure? I haven't seen you look this down before." Celestia looked concerned, walking over to her pupil. "You can tell me anything, Twilight. I promise." The little filly hesitated, turning the page in her book before looking up at the princess, unsure if she'd get in trouble. "I guess I'd of like a near..." Filly Twilight spoke up quietly. The film distorted her voice, shaking the scene being shown. "Why don't you ask one of your classmates? I'm sure they'd love to study with you." Celestia smiled comfortingly at her. "Oh, no, I can't. All need to stud. I do. I'm just sure I'd just get in their way." Twilight fumbled with her words, looking up pleadingly at the princess. Celestia thought about her words for a moment, before realizing something. "I know just the perfect partner for you." Celestia smiled happily, turning her head and calling out, "Spike! Spike, could you come here real quick?" The filly opened her mouth to speak, but before any sound came out, the film began to skip, before breaking apart the movie playing. The light faded, and the light of the room returned with it. "Moondancer? What did that..." Twilight turned to look back at the mare hanging from the wall, before letting out another gasp. The mare hanging from the wall was no longer Moondancer. This new mare had a violet mane with a magenta coat, lacerated in the same way Moondancer had just been. It took Twilight a moment to realize who the mare was, before she covered her mouth in horror. "Sparkler," she murmured quietly. She didn't know what happened to Moondancer, but Lance's words came to mind. The town was just playing tricks on her mind again. Moondancer had never been there, but now Sparkler was. Please be another illusion," Twilight begged to the silent air around her. Her horn lit up as she cast her magic, hoping the magic would once again be repelled by the nails, and that she could prove Sparkler wasn't actually dead. Her magic caught the nails and pulled them out. She gently levitated Sparkler's body to the ground in front of her, trying to hold back the tears at the edges of her eyes as she placed an ear to Sparkler's chest. She sat there, trying to listen for the faintest trace of a heartbeat, something to tell her that she could possibly save Sparkler. One never came. Twilight grit her teeth, not wanting to believe this was true, but this was exactly the same thing that had happened to Winter. It couldn't have been a coincidence that she'd been thrust into this room. It couldn't have been a coincidence that she'd found Sparkler like this. The world was trying to give her a message. The message a crucifix carried, warning that if you stepped out of line, you'd be offended the wrong pony, that if you did something objectable, it was punishable by death. The world and its twisted ways, with its mind games, monsters, and rules, was telling her she had to obey or be killed. Sparkler. Derpy, I'm sorry, she whispered to herself, feeling the heat of her tears rolling down her face once more. She knew about Sparkler. Derpy had adopted her almost a year ago. They'd had a tough time adjusting to the life. Twilight had watched them have fights, reconcile over family time, enjoying each other's company, laughing and playing. Every pony knew they weren't having the easiest of times. Derpy was a single mother with a job that paid moderately and was paying for 2 kids. But she was the type of mare, the type who would do anything for her foals, who couldn't wake up in the morning without seeing the bright smiling faces of her 2 beautiful daughters. And there laying before Twilight was one of them. No longer able to smile, no longer able to laugh or play with her mother or sister. All so she could be displayed as a message to Twilight. You were right, Lance. Twilight quickly wiped her face as she managed to calm herself. This place messes with your mind, disrespects the ponies that live here. She looked down at Sparkler. She knew she had to do something for her, some memorial, some grave for her to be remembered. But to do it right, she'd have to make her way out of the hotel. She still had to make sure Lance was okay as well. She had to go back out into Ponyville and find her friends, and Princess Celestia. Twilight stilled her nerves once more, standing up and looking down at Sparkler's body. Sparkler, I promise. I'll be right back for you. I'll give you a burial you deserve. I'll let your mom know what happened to you. Twilight ran her hoof across her face one last time, sniffing as she managed to stand up. She approached the door and raised her hoof to it and pressed against the handle. This time it clicked open, creaking slightly as it opened to the world outside the door. Beyond the door appeared to be a hotel lobby. The lavender mare would have been surprised if she hadn't expected the change in location by now. The lobby was just as decrepit as the rest of the hotel. The carpet was dulled brown, the reception desk rotted, broken, and long since disused. There were several doors lining the lobby, and she could see clearly 2 hallways that extended further into more rooms, but she couldn't see down them just yet. In the middle of the floor, Twilight could see a rather sizable dried bloodstain, likely the spot where Lance had found her. The unicorn quickly walked over to the bloodstain in the middle of the carpet, inspecting it carefully. Just as Lance had said, there was only one spot of noticeable blood, meaning it was likely that she had only been the one there. Rarity's body, or even her blood, was nowhere to be found. I'm going to have to take that as a good sign, Twilight muttered to herself, looking around the lobby again. She was right there with me when I passed out. If her blood's not here, then maybe she's somewhere else and safe. She has to be, she said to herself, not to convince herself, but to reinforce her will. She quickly looked around for any other sign she could find, a clue as to where Rarity went, any sign of what had become of the strange alicorn she had fought, any indication of what this had been the same place that she had passed out in. Her search turned out empty, though. She let out a reluctant sigh, but moved on quickly into one of the hallways. She figured Lance had to be down one of these corridors. It only made sense. Coming around a bend in the hallway, she was stopped at the sight of a massive pile of debris that blocked off the hallway. No doubt, the same one that the creature had caused when it crashed in and attacked them. Her medallion wasn't buzzing, and she couldn't hear a single sound coming from the other side. "Lance!" Twilight called out, trying to get an open spot in the debris to look at what had become of the scene. "Lance, are you there? Answer me if you can!" She yelled loudly, not caring if she had attracted the attention of the monster back out of hiding. She needed to know if the Pegasus was alright or not. She waited a moment or two, waiting to hear back from him. Only silence returned. She called out for him once more, but when the silence continued, she realized she wasn't getting any response. "Lance, I hope you really are okay," Twilight murmured into the air, turning away from the hallway. If the path was blocked there wasn't any way she was going to be able to get to him. Her magic didn't obey her in this world, and she had to face the reality that she needed to move on. If helping Lance was out of the question, then her next objective was to give Sparkler the proper burial she deserved. Returning to the lobby, she was about able to spot the double doors that looked like an exit. She quickly walked over to it, expecting the doors to be locked and her to be sent on some roundabout puzzle all over the rest of the hotel, just to get a key to open the door. However, the door simply creaked open, revealing a fog-filled world outside. Ash was still falling from the sky, creating a thin layer on the ground everywhere. It seemed that night had fallen at some point during the town. Night. Twilight murmured, looking up at the darkened, foggy sky. "It's nighttime. Does that mean that Luna's raised the moon? Is she aware of what's going on at Ponyville?" She wondered aloud, not sure of what to think. I wonder if she knows of what happened to Princess Celestia. Various thoughts ran through her mind at that moment, none of which seemed to fully pan out in her mind. At some point she figured Luna would notice what's going on, or that her sister was missing. The unicorn shook her head and took a deep breath, calming herself again. She had to go through this one challenge at a time. She quickly walked back into the lobby, and opened the door to the room she had found herself in. Sparkler's body lay there serenely, waiting to be given the proper send-off. The aura of purple soon found itself wrapped around that mare's body, lifting it ever so gently into the air. With the grace she deserved, Sparkler was carried out of the hotel and into the dark night of Ponyville. The purple aura gently placed the magenta mare down on the ash-covered grass. Twilight concentrated her magic and once more made a shovel appear from thin air. She quickly struck it in the ground and began to dig a hole. Each scoop brought more dirt from the ground, creating a bigger and bigger hole. Suddenly the shovel struck something hard. The magic holding the item together grew unstable and shattered into nothing more. Twilight cursed under her breath and looked into the hole, spying the rock that the shovel had hit on its way down. She levitated the rock out of the hole before carefully reforming the shovel from magic. It wasn't long before Twilight was satisfied with the hole she had dug. She gently lifted Sparkler's body with her magic and laid it to rest at the bottom of the hole. She then lifted the pile of dirt she had dug up and placed it back into the hole, making sure that it was flat and even before being satisfied. Then she created the final piece, forming a block of wood in the shape of a tombstone. Upon its surface she wrote the words, "Here lies Sparkler, a wonderful mare, a wonderful daughter, a loving sister, and a beautiful mare." She fixed the gravestone at the edge of the grave, marking it as Sparkler's resting place. Once the grave was finished, she sat at the foot of it, watching it quietly. A breeze blew through the silent town, sending a short shiver down her back. The temperature had dropped, it seemed, though it wasn't as cold as the snow that had littered the ground when she had gone to sleep for the night. It was as still a dark contrast to the muggy air that had resided before. She tried to pay it no mind, though, closing her eyes to give Sparkler a moment of peace. "I should probably say something, huh?" The lavender mare asked, quietly, to the grave. The wind blew the bangs in front of her eyes as she pondered over her words. "I'm sorry you had to die this way, Sparkler." Her words were soft, almost lost to the breeze around her. "I wish I could have been there to save you. I don't know how I would have, but I wish She grit her teeth, remembering Winter's body, remembering Lance being dragged away, remembering Rarity being impaled by that alicorn sword. I wish I could have prevented all of this from happening. I wish I could protect every pony. I still remember when your mom decided she was going to adopt you. You know that? Twilight chuckled softly at the grave, moving a hoof to her face to wipe it gently. It was kind of a shock to everyone who knew your mom. She already seemed to be having a hard time raising her daughter as it was, and then she suddenly adopted you. She didn't tell anybody why, and I can't say I was able to understand that thinking, but the smile on her face showed the fragile nature of the memories she could remember, and why they were so precious. I could see on her face, when she was with you, she was happy. She loved you, Sparkler, and I know that if she could have done anything for you back there, she would do it. That's the kind of mother she was. The mare lifted her hoof and gently placed it on top of the flat soil before her. Please, rest in peace. I'm going to put an end to this nightmare, and I'll make sure that your death wasn't in vain. The pony stood, the wind tossing her mane, the flakes of ash falling on her body. She turned to the road the hotel was connected to. She looked around, spying a particular set of trees and plant life that was slowly turning white around it. The bumps of the road, the familiar places of geography. She knew where she was. She had been down that path many times before. It was forever etched into her mind now. This was the road to Fluttershy's house. Fluttershy. Rainbow Dash. Twilight muttered, looking down the path into the darkness. She couldn't see their house from here. On a normally clear day like that, she could have. She had been at their wedding just yesterday. She could still remember watching the ceremony unfold, organizing the event, how beautiful Fluttershy had been in her dress, the love she felt between them when they spoke their vows, how they said they were going to leave for their honeymoon the next day, to rest from the excitement of the celebration, and to have all their friends see them off. They had to be stuck in this world as well, being tormented by these monsters, their heads being toyed with like this was all some game, watching as the ponies they cared about get hurt or killed. In the distance, Twilight could hear something echoing through the town. It reverberated low across the air and over her coat. She knew the roar of the creature that it had come from. It was the dragon that had attacked her in the middle of town. The mare grit her teeth in frustration. She gazed at the darkness, resolve hardening inside of her, and a glare directed at the misery that was the town. She was going to find and protect her friends. She was going to find the princess. She was going to bring an end to this misery. Striking the ground, she ran as fast as her legs could carry her, to the cottage where two of her friends now lived.